case studies there. Oh, we have recording in progress. Fifthly, many things can and will be inferred from your data, your social media, and a thing called metadata. And so we'll get to some of the definitions in a bit. The sixth is the protections and rectifications from errors and misuse of data are pretty weak. And the examples there are robo-debt, and you'll learn about iVote from New South Wales. Point 7, commercial deals on data collected and shared are often kept secret. So the Vic Roads deal, we can't see the details. ABC iView's sharing and sale of our data is not transparent, and they've refused FOI requests. Eighth point, the new tools of oppression include AI-assisted exclusions and digital background checks. So basically, you don't need humans anymore to go through job applications. AI will do it for you. And surprise, surprise, a whole bunch of people are excluded. It sounds like old guard exclusion by color, by sexuality, by gender. So that's the future. Second last point is security clearances used to be a thing done for hundreds of people. Now it is hundreds of thousands of people. And they seek details, actually verification of sexual conduct, drugs, gambling, dissent, social media. It is indeed like Kafka's trial. So you may be exiled or arrested for reasons that remain a mystery. The final point is the data managers are often subject to sovereignty conditions. So you've got to be, sovereign to Australia. But we invite in a whole bunch of the military industrial complex players from the US who seem to have allegiances to American intelligence agencies, including programmatic managers of global collection of data. So I will share some of those details with you. Let's see if I can move on. Okay, so in terms of data capture, we have hundreds of data centers around the country and still growing. And they're all busy and they're all tens of millions of dollars of business. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. So as Yana says, you can kind of run a 50% profit margin on those things, and most of them are foreign-owned. There's a postmodern public aim, often stated, to have the perspective of a single view of the citizen. You're Jamie Gardner. We know all about you. Here's your Medicare number. Here's your, blah, blah, blah. And so government can see all of the things about you to better serve you. And there's even this idea that a good government listens and looks and has all your data so that they can serve your need, even if you don't want them in your life. And this includes our governments. So traditional topics cover, births, deaths, marriages, passports, driver's license, crimes, medical, education. The new national identity platform that's being worked is that you will have all of those linked so that you don't have to continue to prove your identity over and over again. You'll be able to do it to the tax office, you'll be able to do it to Medicare, and then you can just say, click Centrelink or click Aged Care or click Hex Debt or, click Passport. Theoretically, that's the promise. But we're now building very large databases that are linked. Medicare data, there's like 2 billion records. The minimum data sets for hospitals that I moved were billions of lines of data. The passport biometrics is now 14 million people with images. And then there's some surprisingly personal stuff, which I'll talk to you about: perinatal mortality, DNA profiles, there's fingerprints. Apparently the Commonwealth government has more than 1 billion facial images. And it's like, why? But also, the stuff that the government doesn't collect, they allow contractors to tell them insights about what's done by third-party contractors. So you have data miners who will look at your social media. If you apply for a job but don't give your LinkedIn, they'll find your LinkedIn. If you have a story in the newspaper, it'll be Googled. And increasingly, this will be automated with artificial intelligence. Tell us everything you might need to know about Peter Fitzgerald. Is he really a friend of Julian Assange? You know, give me the skinny. This is a list of the hospital data sets that I used to have some data custodianship of, and they're called national minimum data sets, a very 1980s and 90s concept where all the states agreed the data that we would collect for a set of these things. So alcohol and other drug treatment services, elective surgery, mental health, outpatients, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just going to show you the detail of one of these, the perinatal national minimum data set, looks not just at live births, but stillbirths, also pregnancies beyond 20 weeks that are discontinued, so late-term abortions. I remember talking this through to the Ministerial Council of Health Ministers. At the time, they were primarily women, so it was a majority women. And the first comment that came back after looking at these details was, if you're a woman, you could identify yourself in this database, because it had details such as, you know, birth event, so sort of anesthetic administered, labor onset, you know, state territory of birth, APGAR score, interesting stuff. But then also the pregnant female was a smoker, attendee of antenatal classes, and then some detailed stuff. Area of usual residence down to a statistical level 2, country of birth, indigeneity status, etc., etc. If you just have date of birth and postcode, it's most likely there's only one of you in the postcode. If you then know that someone was at a particular hospital, you can have a long data set of all the births in the country and actually find yourself. And so if this was released and shared around agencies, anyone who had reason to find out, oh, well, we know that you've had mental health issues, let's see about your abortion. So the re-identification thing is an issue. Data sharing amongst agencies. You will think, I remember talking to David Kalish, who was the head of the ABS, and I put to him, do you ever share data for the census with any other agency? He said, well, you know, Peter, we've got very strict rules. The ABS has legislation. I said, yes, but what if someone else has legislation and it says, we want to have a look at how many Muslim kids there are in northern Sydney who are 17 years of age? He said, well, if they have their own specific legislation, of course I'd have to give it to them. And so what happens is, so Jamie's laughing and scoffing. If the legislation says, and you can look at any other things that might be relevant, then you have a right to ask another agency for the data. And so I'm going to give you a case study. So we ask migrant candidates to do medical tests. And we ask them a set of things like body mass index, you know, blood pressure, visual acuity, specialist tests like HIV, Hep B, TB, and then the sharing arrangements. Now, this was from the Public Information Digest, that was the Australian Information Commissioner, which they've discontinued this degree of transparency, by the way. But the external sharing arrangements of this data was for, and I bolded it there, Australian government agencies authorised to receive information relating to ... adoption, border control, business skills, citizenship. You see this is alphabetical. Education, health insurance, health services, law enforcement, payment of pensions, taxation, superannuation, review of decisions, child protection, registration of migrants. When I showed this to a group of people in Canberra, they looked at each other and said, who's missing? Who doesn't get access to this data? So what we're saying is the border control and immigration people are collecting data down to the level of your head circumference and then sharing it with anyone who says they might want the information. This is not good practice, and it's not consistent really with any privacy principles. And as a result, you had a data spill. So a friend of mine, Asher Wolf, who's a social media activist on the platform formerly known as Twitter, went to the website and found that you could download an Excel spreadsheet with a list of names with all this detail. And so it was described then as, one of the most serious breaches in Australian history. And so she wrote an article about it in The Guardian, for which she was hounded for being a hacker. But she found it basically on the website. But it had been shared with everyone in Canberra. And so point one is there's unusual degrees of sharing. The second point is the data storage is mostly insecure. Now, maybe this is a truism, most people are insecure, but our data storage, we're paying a lot of money for, it's not really secure. And so you get the bad news headlines, which I'll talk to you about in a second, but there's also a thing called penetration testing as part of vulnerability management. And that requires you to get some white hat hackers to see whether they can get into your servers. And I've spoken to the top pen testers in the country, and I say, well, what % of Canberra agencies would you be able to get into? And they say, well, we have to have a budget. And so if you have, a few days, maybe a week, we can get into most. I said, so what do you mean most? Oh, well, pretty well all. 10 days get you pretty well all. And so in effect, any professional who wanted to get into the servers of a data center in Canberra has pretty well a good track record of being able to get in.
Hacking.
And so someone is not on mute. And so I put this together 5 years ago. These were a set of headlines about health data back when I was a health bureaucrat. And the headlines are pretty much the same. Health data highly vulnerable, according to the Auditor General. APS agencies slow to roll out cybersecurity. These headlines happen again and again. At this time it was the WannaCry cyber attack, which was a ransomware attack on hospitals. This goes on and on. Nothing has changed in Canberra, and I think Victoria, according to some good sources, are years behind New South Wales on these things. So I'm going to talk and then hand over to Vanessa. Data that's released into the wild are often done under things called open data releases. And as a policy, it's a good thing. So encourage agency to share de-identified data. You often get researchers and innovators across social and physical sciences. We even have hackathons. It's a real generationally popular thing. And people sort of delve into big databases to see what they can find. But there's a couple of case studies in which Vanessa has been able to say, well, no, you said it was de-identified, but you haven't done the work. So the first of those, can you tell us about the Mikey case study, Vanessa?
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so this is close to home here in Melbourne. So you probably never think about it, but every time that you tap your Mikey on or off, it makes a record in a giant database somewhere. And the record contains the identity of the place that you tapped on or off. It contains the information about whether it was an on or an off tap. It contains some information about the card, such as whether it's a concession or an adult's card, whether it's an MP's card or a police officer's card, etc. And obviously it contains the exact time down to the second and the link to the specific individual identity of the card. Some people, for reasons I don't understand, register their Mikey card so it's got their name as well. But even if you don't, there's a tremendous amount of very detailed information about your travels. So the Victorian government, in its infinite wisdom, decided it'd be great fun to just give that entire database to somebody. They took the names off, but they didn't put any significant effort into obfuscating any of the data. And so it's really easy to identify people. And in particular, since each card has a unique identifier that is repeated across all of the different interactions with that card, what you effectively get for one person is a great big long list of exactly where they tapped on or off at exactly what time over, in some cases, years. So all you have to do if you want to uniquely identify a person is one of a couple of simple things. Number one, if it's a person that you travel with and you know really well, then you can identify your own card. For example, if you've registered it, you can look it up online and figure out the exact moment that you tapped on together and spot that person from that one interaction alone. Or alternatively, if you've got a bit of public information about somebody, for example, the now Minister Anthony Carbine's tweeted a lot about his use of public transport and tweeted pictures of where he was tapping on and off. And even though the specific down to the minute time wasn't necessarily all that accurate, the combination of 3 or 4 different locations over a week or two was enough to make him unique. So there's not necessarily anything wrong with being able to identify a record that tells you something you already knew. The problem with this kind of data is that you can take a little bit of information that you already knew, use it to identify the record, and then pull back out of the database all of the other tap on or tap on events, tap off events for that person that they didn't voluntarily share with you.
And Vanessa, you're saying that you were able to identify the police minister.
Correct. He was not the police minister at the time, but he
wasn't. And so you weren't looking for him. You just found that there was an MP category of ticket. Is that what it was?
No, we were looking for him because I did a Google search for something like MPs tweeting about public transport or something, and he came up a lot. Okay. So we were looking for him in particular just because he had this Twitter profile that was all about public transport. So we knew that he'd be easy to spot in the public transport.
Now, I can't see the chat function. Are there any questions that people have or comments at this point? No. In which case, I might move on to the next one. Tell us about the medical billing data sets.
Okay, so this actually happened first. This happened back in 2016. Janet knows all about this. The Commonwealth Department of Health gets basically a little bill every time you get either a Medibank or PBS reimbursement. So every time you go to the GP and they effectively charge your Medicare card, or every time you go to the pharmacist and you get a PBS subsidized medication, they're effectively billing the government for that thing. And so this makes, again, a database record, and the record contains quite a lot of very detailed information. It includes some information about your identity, which I don't know in great detail because that was actually redacted from the dataset, but at the very least it contains your IHI number. Somebody remind me what IHI number is. Individual Health Identifier.
Sorry, yep.
And the identifier of the provider, who is either a pharmacist or a doctor or whatever other medical professional. It contains a billing code, which is the specific thing that you are charging for. And that might be something as vague as a GP visit, or it might be something as specific as a particular surgery or a particular pharmaceutical. And then it contains a bunch of other billing kind of metadata, the exact date, the what state you're in, and a bit of other stuff as well.
And are you telling us that you did you identify individuals?
Yes. So the Commonwealth Department of Health decided it'd be fun to select 10% of the population, and for each of those lucky people to publish the entire list of their Medicare bills for the whole 30 years from 1984 to 2014, and most of the PBS bills for the same period. If you have, and they weren't completely unaware of the serious privacy implications of this. They removed people's birth dates, although they left the years in. And they didn't really have very much demographic information about people except for gender. So there's a gender, year of birth, and the state that the person lives in. And they knew that dates could be identifying, so they chose a random number between -20 and +20. And for each individual person, they shifted all of the dates in their record either forwards or backwards by that amount. Sorry, -14 to +14. So a month of window. But that's just not enough. And so if you know 2 or 3 things about a person, and the standing example that I used was if you have a friend who has given birth in a Medicare charged setting, which is people with private health insurance, for example, then you can pick 2 or 3 dates at which that friend has given birth and search for all of the women born in the same year in the database who had 2 babies in those 2 28-day intervals, and it is overwhelmingly likely that your friend is unique.
And how did the Commonwealth respond to your things? I'm going to say, did they think you were a smartass, or how did they respond?
So this is the famous George Brandis, let's take a holiday out from the Constitution and proclaim a new crime off the cuff response. So they decided that the right way to solve the problem associated with this data breach was to make it a crime to explain to the public that there had been a data breach.
So not a crime to release.
Correct. Nobody got into any serious trouble for releasing the data, but we nearly went to jail for demonstrating that the data was re-identifiable, except that we didn't really go to jail because members of the executive do not actually get to make up new crimes. That's not actually the way parliamentary democracy works. So anyway, in the end, it was all just a lot of aggro for nothing. There is no re-identification ban in Australia, despite Brandis pretending that there was. And so you are free if you see irresponsibly released data to demonstrate that it is re-identifiable and tell the public.
Vanessa, I'm going to move on to the next stuff about metadata, but I think it builds on your point.
Sorry, just one more thing. Sorry, Peter. There is still, even in the proposed reforms to the Commonwealth Privacy Act, even though we now have a Labor government, there is still a line item in that proposed reform to ban re-identification. So that is a disgrace. Just saying. I don't even know how that terrible idea still hangs around. Anyway, okay. Sorry. Go on, Peter.
We will consider this. Now, I'm going to give you now a warning that was given by the US Supreme Court about metadata. And so metadata is not the data of your phone call. It's the time and place of your phone call and the fact that you have a number and the other person has a number. And so we would say, well, look, there's no privacy issues there, but actually there is. And so what the US Supreme Court had was a case where the FBI, the local police, had put a tracker on someone's car without a warrant. And they said, we don't need a warrant. We're not breaking into anyone's house. We're not arresting them. We're not taking their personal goods. We're just tracking where they move. And so Judge Breyer says, if you win this case, then there's nothing to prevent the police or the government from monitoring 24 hours a day the public movement of every citizen in the United States. So if you win, you suddenly produce what sounds like 1984. To which I might have said, I think the cat's out of the bag on that. They've already been doing it. And Justice Sotomayor was a bit more poetic. She's saying the monitoring generates a precise, comprehensive record of a person's public movements that reflects a wealth of detail about familial, political, professional, religious, and sexual associations. The GPS data alone will be trips that indisputably private in nature, which takes little imagination to conjure up. Trips to the psychiatrist, the plastic surgeon, the abortion clinic, the AIDS treatment centre, the strip club, the criminal defence attorney, the by-the-hour motel, the union meeting, the mosque, the synagogue, the church, the gay bar, and on and on. Might have put this before the release of the health data, Vanessa, because it's the same point. If you're going to release 10 years of data about every medical procedure done by 10% of the population and then say, I bet you can't re-identify anyone, surprise, surprise, you can. So the final point that Justice Sotomayor says is the government can store all these records and efficiently mine them for information years into the future. That indeed is where we're at. Let me see what I can move on. I'm going to move through a few topics and then see if we can get some discussion up. Topics 6, 7, and 8, where there's a few more things you probably need to know about the current and future landscape in terms of a lack of transparency, poor rectification processes for errors, and a lack of accountability for agencies who misbehave and indeed corporations that misbehave. So the RoboDebt case study, I was in a hacking conference in the Netherlands in 2017, and there was a presentation about RoboDebt then and how it was a misuse of an algorithm. So it was actually a very clumsy use of averaging provisions to persecute hundreds of thousands of Australians, many of whom killed themselves because of the oppression. And there was discussions about what was then a new book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And so it was the warning about the misuse of algorithms and the over-reliance on what you think you know about data, about an individual, and how you really need to protect against this. And so it was 5 years after that became an international topic that we got a Royal Commission who very quickly got the job done and recommended that there be some prosecutions, and it's been sitting with the Commonwealth, what's it called? The NAC, the National Anti-Corruption Commission, who have done nothing with it and not released their reasons. And they're now subject to an Inspector General review of whether they've been engaging in misconduct in not prosecuting as recommended by the Royal Commission. But if I can just say, we have people dead, hundreds of thousands of people oppressed based on what was known as a wrongful algorithm, and nothing changed for 5 or 6 years. There's something wrong with our systems of accountability if that's the case. The second example, and we don't have a detailed slide on this, but the iVote New South Wales errors in the algorithm and coding is something that Vanessa was able, again, to point out. Can I bounce to you, Vanessa, to tell us the story of iVote in just a few minutes?
Yeah, it depends how many minutes you want. But this is a long-running catastrophe of a story, which finally made it into the newspaper many years after I first expected it to, when it crashed in 2021 during the local government elections. The writing had been on the wall for a very long time. They'd messed up the count, they'd messed up the security, they'd had crashes before, but they'd sort of managed to smooth over what had happened. They were very aggressive when problems were pointed out, which seems to be pretty typical. What to say?
So tell me what iVote does. So it's an electronic
iVote is an
voting.
internet voting system used in New South Wales and also briefly used in Western Australia.
And why did you become of a view that there was something wrong with it?
That's a good question. There have been many things wrong with it over many years. Initially, the code was completely secret, so it was quite hard to tell what it was actually doing. But the first time we looked at it really carefully, we found we were able to just look at what it was doing in the web browser and see that part of the code it was pulling down into the web browser was being derived not from the New South Wales Electoral Commission's site, where it should have been coming from, but from a random third party on the internet. And we thought that was not appropriate for a voting session. And so we looked at the security of that third-party site, and we realized that it was possible for an intermediary on the internet to intercept the code that was coming from that site and change it any way that they wanted. And if you changed it any way that you wanted, then you could fiddle the person's vote, mess up their confirmation of their vote, and present an appealing little picture on their screen to make it look as if you had sent exactly the vote that they wanted, when in fact you had sent something completely different. So that was the first year we looked carefully at it. That was 2015. The next year we looked carefully at it. All this time the code is secret, by the way. The company that sold New South Wales the code also sold code to Switzerland, which also runs an internet voting system. And although New South Wales makes it a crime to share the source code without the Electoral Commissioner's consent, Switzerland has the opposite law and mandates that companies selling source code above a certain level for Swiss elections must make it openly available. So companies sold essentially the same code base to two different places. New South Wales kept it secret. Switzerland made it compulsorily open to scrutiny. And as soon as it was made open to scrutiny, it was pretty obvious that it was broken. So we wrote a paper about how it was broken. Switzerland stopped using it. Nobody in New South Wales cared very much. And they kept using it. And then they used it again in 2021. And then it actually crashed. It crashed it had substantial downtime the day before Election Day and substantial downtime on Election Day, to the point where it got into the newspapers and then into the Supreme Court, and the Electoral Commission had to rerun 3 of
during that thing for the medications.
Big pardon.
Do you know this? Yeah, no, it's okay.
Yeah, so people might have heard about that. That was in the news. Our analysis said that they probably should have run about another 30 other contests as well, but 3 seem to be enough to keep everybody happy. I don't know what to say. It's not as if that was a surprise, right? It had been years and years and years of everybody who knew anything about computers saying, don't vote over the internet. This is really stupid. Sooner or later, it's going to cause a catastrophic electoral failure. The literal words catastrophic electoral failure were present in multiple submissions, not just mine, to the relevant parliamentary committee in previous years. And then eventually it happened.
Now, Vanessa, you were attacked personally for having brought to the attention of the public some of these issues.
Indeed.
Can you describe the sort of aggressive response from it?
It was mostly just nastiness, right? It was just writing nasty letters to everywhere I was about to talk, writing nasty letters to the university, writing nasty letters to the newspapers and so forth. Nothing really damaging, just silly and nasty.
Can I say I have something to do with the Victorian Parliamentary Committee that oversees elections? It does seem to be a bit of a gap in that there's not a sense of self-reflection about these problems. So I can just sort of do at least 2 case studies there to the proposition that we don't have accountability and rectification procedures such that you think we would have. That robo-debt could have been fixed in a couple of months after it had been identified. At very least, iVote could have been fixed after its first year. So there's something about, do we have a cargo cult mentality to foreign purchased code? We probably do. We've probably got some problems there. If I then say we exacerbate our own problems by our secrecy. So if I can say the deals on data collected, so if there's a new owner to Vic Roads, or at least a joint venture partner to Vic Roads, it's not an unfair ask to say, what's the deal with data sharing? So does every insurance company get every fine that I ever have? Do they get to sell it to Google? Do they give it to Facebook? Does Elon Musk get all of our drivers' licenses? Those details aren't available, despite there being at least a 10 or 20-year policy within Treasury to fully publish the contracts for public-private partnerships. So I remember talking to Tim Pellis, current treasurer, I'm afraid to say it's 25 years ago, about the transparency of public-private partnerships when he was chief of staff to Steve Braggs. And the policy then was established that the contracts would be fully public. Those contracts are public except for Vic Roads and its $8.7 billion deal with some joint venturers. Vanessa, bounce to you. You've put a FOI request to the ABC for what exactly?
Yes. So when the ABC decided that it would be compulsory to log in order to view iView content, I had a bit of a look at what the iView website was sharing with third parties while you watched. And I made a little video about it on YouTube, which you can go and find if you like. But the short summary is that as you are watching, iVote shares with a variety of third parties, but a particularly nasty one called Tealium, a complete, detailed, up-to-the-minute record of exactly what you're watching all the time. And this record contains the episode, the identification of the show, the time that you're watching it, and importantly, it contains a hash of your email address, which obviously makes it very, very easy to link with everything else that can guess your email address. The ABC's privacy policy at the time was not at all honest about this. It claimed that the data that was shared with third parties was de-identified. That was obviously not true when you looked at what your web browser was sending. The data was obviously not de-identified, even though it didn't have your name written in the clear, but it had specific identifying information about you in terms of the hash of your email address. So I asked them nicely for a bit more information about this. They were extremely obstructive. And eventually I made a Freedom of Information request for the deal between the ABC and Tealium. And the reason that I really wanted to get this deal was that the thing that was being told to the public was not true. But I wasn't sure whether there was anybody with sufficient technical expertise inside the ABC to understand that it was untrue. So in a nutshell, I really wanted to know whether Tealium was lying to the ABC about the identifiability of the data they were collecting, or whether the Tealium was telling the truth to the ABC and the ABC was lying to the public. But the FOI was refused, and I applied to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, and anybody who's done that knows what a total waste of time that is, so we still don't know.
Thank you, Vanessa. We might come back to this because I know there are some ABC advisory committee members here with us this evening, but we'll come back to that. So the grouping there is we don't have the transparency about stuff that we've been promised transparency on. And so, in other words, we're not getting enforcement
and
of the
stuff
policy
that we should have transparency on. So there are technical claims that are being made that are just flat out untrue, and there's not enough transparency about the deal to even understand who is lying to whom.
Wow. Okay. Now the next point is there's new tools of oppression, and I'm saying this as a person who's applied for probably 100 more jobs than I ever got shortlisted for, including a set of jobs that it should be against the law to discriminate on the basis of age, or even for that matter, gender. And particularly if you do some of the online job applications, there is the way they generate a shortlist involves no human content. So it's done by algorithm. And unless you, so if you say, dear George, we've worked together for 20 years, I can do all of the feature of the job. I'm really keen for this job. You probably won't get on the shortlist because you haven't replayed back all of the words of the job specification. Please address all of the 5 criteria, and if you don't, you'll be spat out. So the AI or algorithm of evaluation of job applications is now subject to a set of glitches that look all of a sudden like, I forgot it was a blue line lending practices amongst the banks in the US, where ghettos never got lending because you just didn't do that. You just had a map and you just said no one in that postcode gets any lending. That seems to be the world that we're heading towards. And it's not just loans, it's jobs, rentals. So rental applications now have background checks, including interviews. So it's it's a product of the housing market. But this is at the point at which we're not yet using all of the AI features. And so what could possibly go wrong? Can I speak as a person who's been wrongly data matched? Some of you may be old enough to remember there was a corruption hearing one stage about, it was called Continental Airlines. And they came into Australia as a new entrant and they gave various public figures free airline tickets. And it was a bit of a scandal because the Victorian governor took a free ticket and then had to resign. But they then did a data matching of all of the senior public servants and political advisors in Spring Street, and I came up. And so it was discussed in cabinet, well, we've run through the 10,000 or whatever it was names, and there was one who was identified, which had my surname and date of birth. So there's another Fitzgerald out there of my date of birth. And so I was given an interview by the head of the Public Service Board, who called up and said, oh, Peter, I just want to have a chat. If you've got time at 10:30. And I arrived and they said, oh, we need to talk to you about that trip you took with Continental Airlines. And I said, which trip are you talking about? Oh, so you've taken more? No, I said, I don't know that I've had any. Are you saying you've not had any flights with Continental? It was a mistake. And so I was refused. Do I need to talk to a lawyer? Did I, blah, blah, blah. The problem with, eventually we got over it and we got to laugh about it. And I'm sure whenever someone said, has Peter Fitzgerald ever been accused of corruption? The answer is yes. Is there a file on Peter Fitzgerald in relation to corruption? Yes. Didn't he solve that problem? I know Ken Kogel's on the line here. It was the era in which computers were pretty dumb, but they felt very successful in having matched some data. Now, I think our AI not only is very smart, but it even fills in gaps now. So what could possibly go wrong? And so I think this is where I came back to Kafka. I like the headline. It's funny because it's true with Kafka's trial. It's just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Security clearances are the new thing, as well as background checks. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it used to be just spooks and very top secret sort of people who used to have to get security clearances. It used to be hundreds a year, and then it was thousands, and now it's tens of thousands. And according to some of the data I'd looked at when I gathered this data, it was more than 500,000 over 3 or 4 years. Now, this is separate to working with children checks, of which 500,000 people in Victoria had working with children checks last year. So checking and assessment based on the data is the new thing. And it's only at a security clearance interview that you ever get to be asked legitimately, sort of legitimately, questions about sex, drug taking, gambling, dissent, what you've said in social media. And we're not, we're not judging you. We're just, seeing whether you'll tell us the truth about what we already know. So, about that flight you took on the airline. How do you deny things that you don't know what they have? But I think I'm now trying to tell you that the creep is pretty broad, and what the government doesn't already know about you, they can collect from data miners who can collect stuff outside of the government sector. So they can do the Google searches, and they can do the social media searches, and they can do the news searches. And so I'm kind of a little bit, I don't know, pessimistic about it. And it's exacerbated by the following thing. We talk about sovereignty and say, well, look, fortunately, it's our data. It's our government. What could go wrong? What's happening here? And I've pulled out a court order from Washington, from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and it says top secret, no foreign. That means no foreigners. In relation to the application by the FBI for an order requiring the production of tangible things of Verizon Business Network services. And it requires them to do daily feeds of all telephony metadata in and out of the US and inside the US. And so this was part of the Ed Snowden revelations. And this document in front of you has been declassified. I'd still show it to you if it was classified, but it's been declassified. Why is this relevant to us? It's relevant to us because Verizon is one of our top data managers. So it runs the data centers for health data. And so this very complex thing in the right-hand side here is sets of mainframes and data sets. And at the top left, there's a little stick man there, and they're the state and territory health administrators. Then there's a little square thing with some flames there. So you see the flames, and it's called an external firewall and an internal firewall. And then above the external firewall is a name called Verizon Data Centers. And so not only do they manage the data centers, they won a contract to be the holders of the encryption keys for all Australian Medicare data. And so Vanessa just showed me that they can release 10% of it, but the other 90% is in the control of someone who holds the encryption key so that no one can get in, and except for someone who's under a lawful obligation by the US courts to give all of the data requested by the FBI and the NSA. So although our data centers have sovereignty provisions in it, most of the the military intelligence apparatus of the US include companies that are active in our data centers. And so it's not just the US, it's the UK. And so Macquarie data centers, they even sound very Australian, but they have global partners, and their operating people are all British armaments. And so the global experience in running drone systems in the Middle East. That's the skill set you need to be an Australian data manager at a high security level. So I'm going to I'll say that's my personal, it's not the only example. There's others, and I've been looking at the contracts and who gets them, but this is the cleanest example I have of, it would appear that no amount of involvement with foreign intelligence agencies precludes you being a highly sovereign considered data manager in Australia. So now some questions. And, it's just popped up on the screen there. Facebook would like to access your heart rate. Say not okay. So if I can maybe not screen share anymore, I can then see a broader group of people.
I have to run. I'm really sorry because I promised everybody else I'd be done by 8:30. But if anyone has questions, I've put my email address in the chat. Thanks so much for inviting me, Peter and Janet. And
yes.
I hope this was fun. It was fun for me. Bye, everyone.
So yeah,
See
thank you,
you.
Vanessa.
Thanks for having me.
Stop share. That's it. Okay, is there any hands up? Because I can't see. I can see Marcus. Gallery. Charmaine.
All right. I think it's been very interesting, the Linda Reynolds, Britney Spears trial that's going on at the moment. The access to SMSs, to medical recordings of when medical appointments are made. And we're now moving into this era with AI where even like our Zoom meetings are all being recorded. So is that going to become information that can be used in the court system along with the SMSs and the emails that are not even between the main players in these court cases? I think we're getting into a very messy situation of information and consistency of truth, because people have their opinions changed by actions that are around them. And so what they said last year isn't necessarily going to reflect what's their ideas are at the moment. So it's just a general comment that there's a lot of confusion around.
Charmaine, I can add to that as well. A lot of criminal cases are now being cut short because of metadata. So you can't deny anymore that you weren't in a particular place, or you're given an opportunity to provide the data that shows that you were somewhere else. And so what we're seeing in the Reynolds case is sort of the next iteration of that, not just, as you say, not just the appointment, but when did you make the appointment? It's really quite remarkable. Peter Norton, do you have any comment on the ABC issue?
Look, I was on that ABC Advisory Council for 4 years, up until 4 or 5 years ago now. We challenged the policy that I'm trying to think who the chairperson was. He was the guy running the NBN, and he resigned after the executive director resigned. I think they thought this was all the modern way of doing things, and everyone had to sign up and be a member for iView and so on. And we were a bit naive because no one had the expertise or the experience of that technical area. But we said, why do you have to sign up? Why do you have to give your email and all that? It was clearly a tracing thing. And he was using, through the NBN or he was promoting the ABC to do, what Apple and what Amazon and so they sign you up, and then they know everything that you've looked at, and then they start sending you advertisements. So the ABC started doing that. They said, look, this is the new way. It's not sitting down with a glass of whiskey watching the 7 o'clock news. That's what happened to your grandfather, but it's not going to be what's happening to your son or your grandchildren. So we have to move with the times. It was all rationalised in that sense.
That does seem to be the trend. I think that's part of Charmaine's point as well. It's where are we heading here? Do you have a choice of stopping and getting off? Now, Roberto's very kindly put a question into the chat function about the arrest of the Telegram founder. And so the question there is about the anonymity of encrypted data. It's a really nice couple of points there. So not only are we subject to really constant surveillance of a comprehensive nature, attempts to fly under the radar are easily criminalized. Although in this country, it was, I think, Malcolm Turnbull who encouraged people to use, what we're all using is ... and I've forgotten whether it was Signal or one of the others, but it was encrypted messaging between MPs was the thing to do, because for heaven's sake, don't use the standard text function, because as you say, Charlene, it'll then be discoverable as a matter by the lawyers. So the lawyers have a legal obligation to produce, quote, all relevant information, electronic and otherwise, and someone sees your phone as being relevant to the evidence, it's their task to then get it off. And so what you have is, as a feature in Signal, and I don't know Telegram well enough, but I know in Signal your messages can dissolve after a period of time. So after a week or after a day, depending on what you're doing. And so Telegram is one of those. Oh, and sorry, I should declare an interest. My partner in life is a sponsor of Ricochet, which is a desktop anonymized messaging system that she has some European sponsorship from, for people in oppressed countries such as Iran and a set of other South American countries. And so if you are fearful of your life, how do you communicate with your family? You need to have anonymized communications. So I think the arrest in Paris was really quite outrageous, because it's France is one of those countries that you would assume would be defending free speech and the right to anonymous communication, but we should judge these countries by what they do and not what they say. But do you want to say something on that, Roberta? No, you're in and out.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello. Oh, sorry.
No, you've gone off again.
Sorry, I was just searching for the on button.
That's right.
Yeah, so I've only followed the headlines, but I think the argument, at least publicly, Macron is talking about criminal activity, the suggestion that they've approached Telegram previously about that sort of level of criminal activity and making that a bit more transparent. So at least that's the public argument. And then, of course, Telegram, within the context, it's a Russian entity and used particularly by supporters of Putin and within the context of the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So there's obviously that sort of foreign policy dimension as well. But it is interesting, the step taken to arrest him.
Yes.
And it'd be interesting to see what the charges are, if they are charges, because it goes straight to that question of free speech. Yeah. But again, the issue is about encryption and that level of encryption and whether it can be broken or not. The suggestion is, as I understand it, that the level of encryption, it can't be broken. The maths needed to do it, at the quantum computers that would be needed to do it, make it virtually impossible. Yeah. But it's an interesting debate, political debate, if not a technical one. Thank you.
That is interesting about the encryption question. So Vanessa is a great activist, but she's been warned that if she discusses cryptography with a foreigner, she needs a permit from Defence. And so this is a real thing, because knowledge about cryptography is a national defence asset, and it can't be exported from Australia without permission of Defence. And so even an academic doing research can't team up with a foreigner to talk about encryption in this country without permission from the Defence Department. So it's quite oppressive in terms of free speech and innovation. And so innovation can happen provided that you're in the military industrial complex and you're, locked up with secrecy provisions and, guidance from above. Any other questions or comments? Pamela? No? If there's not other questions, I'm happy to take feedback offline, but I certainly wanted to share what I know about the landscape. We haven't spoken about directly
Peter, I think
birth
Rosie Elliott was putting her hand up.
Oh, okay. Definitely. Rosie?
Oh, thanks. That was absolutely fantastic and interesting, Peter. And I just as a sort of something a bit lighter to say in signing off, my favourite moment in Red Dwarf, I probably most people here used to watch Red Dwarf, was when Crichton was talking and wanted to be human, but he had to learn to lie. I don't know whether you remember him trying to teach you can't be human unless you're allowed to lie. So you're able to lie, yes. And so he was trying to, it was a great moment in Red Dwarf. And it's how I also feel about money. Even though I use my credit card, the fact that we're all being forced to be honest, it's only the rich now who can get away with thievery. So
that's a very good point. In fact, there are some other questions in the chat. So one is about what can individuals do about this? I think we do have to fight the creep. If I just use security clearance as an example, to be called into an interview and then told that if you lie, it's a felony. And, when did you last smoke dope? We know when it was. Or when did you last look at porn? Or when did you last, make a wager on the horses? They've got their cheat sheet and you're being invited to tell the truth. And if that's not oppression, I don't know what is. It's like, oh, don't worry, it's just about your promotion or your job, or whether you want to be involved in data management at all, because the data management's now being moved into a security bubble. And there's a lot of talk about the only way to improve cybersecurity is to have a culture of security. And the only way to have a culture of security is to have security clearances. It sounds almost axiomatic as a truism, but we're slipping in that direction. And I know as a team leader during the pandemic, all of my staff members were looking for tenancies, and they had to get references from their boss, and I had to do interviews with the landlords. And I know that they were checking what's the nationality of this person, what's their visa status. We've created an atmosphere, I say we, that as Giannis is saying, we had nothing to do with this. We've slipped into it. It's sort of like Murdoch and his business model. He's just slipped into this fabulous money machine that is divisive and not democracy enhancing. It's the opposite. And so it makes me wonder whether we're slipping as a matter of fate or as a matter of technological determinism. But the direction is, and I'm looking across the faces, we are the older generation. We are not leaving a happy, healthy democracy. Charmaine. Go ahead, Charmaine.
Just one thing is that one of the main things missing in all of this is effective international law.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because the whole thing brings in perspective where the speaker is and where the listener is. And we've arrived here, 70 years since the United Nations, and we have no effective international law to deal with all the things that are happening at the moment.
And into that breach is the data billionaires, and so we Australia have agreed to intellectual property laws that pay rents to Silicon Valley and to Big Pharma in the US. You know, we signed a deal. I've forgotten which one of the trade agreements in the early 2000s, that if drugs expire in their patent period in the US, Australia won't purchase other competing drugs for 5 years. So I think it was Odonastrum was being targeted, I think, at like $50 a pill, and it was going to fall out of patent. But the Australian government made an agreement with the US government that we wouldn't buy out of patent product for 5 more years. So in effect, we are just continuing on a rental arrangement with the overlord.
And it's not about health.
It's not about health.
It's about billionaires or billionaire organizations.
Or staying in good with the bosses. I tried to do some numbers to say what sort of money were we giving to the big data players in the US. And I noticed that Services Australia give IBM $200 million a year. But I couldn't count the contracts that defense and police were giving to a set of the American data miners. So it was like 50 contracts for Palantir. So Palantir are data miners. They became famous when they put a plan together to neutralize WikiLeaks. So they put a proposition that got leaked, and the proposition was to do a set of information ops to target critical infrastructure, to target journalists with misinformation, and to sow discord amongst supporters of WikiLeaks. So this was a data mining and information operations company. And so I can share with anyone the PowerPoint that says, let's press go on this operation. It has 50 contracts that I can see on the Commonwealth Government website for data and related services. And so I'm trying to work out exactly what do they do. But they're doing it over and over again, millions of dollars at a go.
I would encourage people to look up what TNI is.
Yeah, okay.
Everybody's heard of TNI, but it's supposedly a clean censorship system that was started by the BBC and applies to about probably 20 media outlets. And they actually determine what truth is to come out and what's to be censored.
Right. We are still recording, so I might say nothing more. If anyone's interested in the data mining, it's called Palantir. Any other final comments? I've enjoyed it. I feel better by letting other people know what I know.
Yeah, sorry, Peter.
But I'm going to hand over to Janet.
Yeah, I was wondering who would like Peter to do this again and to do more. I certainly do. And who thinks that he and Vanessa, and if Sue-Alette could help, we need a book. Can I suggest Stasi Australia, or KGB down south or down under? Anyone else coming up with some good titles? But I really think this is so important. And whether we do a session perhaps with the Justice and Democracy Committee and have another online. We didn't do the publicity well enough for this, so we didn't get through to enough people, and I've stuffed up the recording. I really do need someone to help me when doing these things. I think this is too important to let just flow over, because Peter's an extraordinary source of wisdom on what's happening with government. And, you know, we live in a dream world about what's happening to our data and what's happening to our minds and our personalities. And the fact of the way in which you can be thwarted from getting jobs and all sorts of positions by stuff you've got
How
no
come
control of having been connected.
that's not working?
It is, you know, terrifying. So can I have hands up from people whether they'd like some more? Yeah, I thought so. Yep. So we'll do that next year. And we are having a fundraising dinner on the 14th of November when another great champion of free speech will be the star performance, and that's Josh Bornstein, talking about his new book coming out, which is on how corporations control our speech. So we'll be sending out information about that. But I think this is something we need to develop in the Labor Academy and do something more again. So Peter and Vanessa in absence, thank you so much. This has just been absolutely brilliant. And we've got to capture all the wisdom in your head and get it through to people in the party. Has everyone enjoyed it?
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Pleasure. Yeah. How can I leave?